Welcome to the College of Licensed Practical Nurses of Manitoba's 2024 Annual Professional Learning Module. The focus of this year's learning module is your professional responsibilities related to documentation. Note that if for any reason you need to close this learning module before you have completed it, your progress will not be saved. Simply take note of where you are in the module before closing the browser, so you can fast forward to the same spot when you have time to return to it. Once you have completed this learning module, you will need to complete a brief quiz, which is being developed to confirm your understanding of the material. The quiz will be comprised of 15 questions. At the end of this module, we will provide you with the specific instructions on how to access the quiz. Why has the CLPNM prioritized documentation for this year's learning module? We understand that, for many nurses, this topic may seem entry-level. However, the CLPNM regularly receives requests for presentations on this topic. As well, nearly half of all complaints submitted to the CLPNM since 2021 have included concerns about, or have led to the identification of concerns about, the nurse's ability to adhere to the standards and principles of documentation. In addition, the CLPNM has heard from a number of healthcare employers across the province who have expressed concerns about current nursing documentation practices. To help proactively address some of these challenges, this annual professional learning module has been developed as a refresher or reminder to all CLPNM registrants. This presentation focuses on your professional standards related to documentation and emphasizes the rationale for clear, complete, accurate, timely, and secure documentation. Although LPNs must meet their professional standards in all settings where they practice, each practice setting may have additional specific guidelines. So while this presentation will provide an overview of your professional standards, it will not provide detailed instructions on how to document in a way that meets the specific policy requirements of your employer. LPNs who continue to have questions following this learning module are encouraged to review policy and consider some additional self-directed learning on documentation principles and procedures. The practice of practical nursing in Manitoba is guided at all times by legislation, as well as professional standards, a code of ethics, and practice directions. Many of the professional responsibilities related to documentation can be found in the CLPNM's Standards of Practice and Conduct document, which we will review in this next section. Members of the public and other members of the healthcare team can have confidence in the care provided by a Manitoba licensed practical nurse, knowing that LPN practice is subject to these standards. The CLPNM Standards of Practice and Conduct are authoritative statements that define professional expectations for practical nurses in Manitoba. The standards of practice and conduct are applicable to all practical nurses in all settings, roles, and practice areas. The primary purpose of the standards is to direct safe, ethical, and clinically competent practice and professional conduct. The next 5 slides provide an overview of the standards related to documentation. These slides provide time for you to read the specific statement and to reflect briefly on how the standard applies in your practice. Meeting these standards is an expectation for all Manitoba's practical nurses. Standards 50 and 51 speak to the obligation to document client care in a record specific to the client, and in a manner that is chronological, legible, clear, timely, accurate, comprehensive, and concise. Later on in this presentation, we will include scenarios to help you visualize how to adhere to these standards. Standard 41 speaks to the obligation to ensure that documentation is detailed enough to ensure that your healthcare team members can understand the care that you provided. Like Standard 41, Standards 42 and 43 speak to the importance of good documentation as a means of communicating with others involved in the client's healthcare. Documentation is one of the ways you provide timely information to other members of the team. Documentation also helps to ensure safe transitions for clients across shifts, providers, settings, and services. Documentation, as a communication tool, contributes to and enhances the effectiveness of the overall team. This important principle is addressed in Standard 48. The CLPNM's Standards of Practice and Conduct also reinforce the LPN's obligation to protect the privacy and confidentiality of client health information and to follow the employer's guidelines and policies respecting the care and custody of health records. When guidelines and policies do not exist or are not consistent with legislation, such as Manitoba's Personal Health Information Act, PHIA, LPNs have a responsibility to advocate for change. This may mean bringing up the topic with management and collaborating with management to establish or review policies. These obligations and responsibilities are addressed in Standards 52 and 53. The LPN's obligation and responsibility to protect the confidentiality of client health information is reinforced in the profession's Code of Ethics. All CLPNM registrants in all roles and settings are held accountable for understanding, upholding, and promoting the ethical standards in the Code of Ethics. The Code complements the standards of practice and conduct by articulating specific ethical expectations which are based on the values of the nursing profession. There are 6 broad ethical standards in the Code. Ethical Standard 3 addresses the ethical management of personal health information and specifically reinforces the LPN's obligation to ensure the privacy and confidentiality of a client's personal health information. While all standards apply to all practical nurses regardless of practice area, Standard 54A to D are additional standards that apply to LPNs who practice in a self-employed capacity. Like some of the standards we reviewed earlier, these standards reinforce the responsibilities that have been established in Manitoba's Personal Health Information Act, PHIA. As an example, Standard 54A states that an LPN who is self-employed and who is therefore a custodian of client health records under FIA, must establish and follow policies and procedures that provide for the protection of client health records. Self-employed LPNs must also ensure that they have processes in place to securely store client information for at least 10 years after the date of the last entry. In the case of a minor, the records must be retained for at least 10 years after the client has reached the age of majority. These responsibilities are set out in Standard 54B. The retention of client records, even after the therapeutic relationship has ended, ensures that clients are able to access their own health information should they wish to. Access to one's own health information is a right of all Manitobans under FIA. Retaining documentation also ensures that records are available should they ever be needed for legal purposes. A client's right to autonomy over their own health information extends to their right to request a transfer of their health records from one provider to another. If you are a self-employed LPN, Standard 54C speaks to your obligation to ensure that such a request is fulfilled promptly, but in any case, within 30 days. Standard 54D outlines the responsibility to advise clients when a self-employed practice is about to be closed. Clients must be given an opportunity to request a copy of their record or to request that the record be transferred to another healthcare professional. The professional standards that are specific to self-employed LPNs are complemented by the CLPNM's Practice Direction on Self-Employed Practice. This practice direction sets out more detailed expectations related to establishing and following policies and procedures, ensuring informed consent, documenting in client health records, managing health records, collaborating with the interprofessional team, making and following up on referrals, and continuing to protect client interests while winding down a self-employed practice. All LPNs who practice in a self-employed capacity must read and familiarize themselves with the responsibilities found in this practice direction, which can be accessed from the CLPNM website. Now that we've discussed the professional standards that relate to documentation, we'll move on to discussing in more detail how the standards apply in a nurse's professional practice. Nursing documentation is defined as an action that produces a written account of all pertinent data, clinical decisions, interventions, and client responses in a health record. Documentation provides information about the client care provided, the client's response to that care, and is a vital component of safe, ethical, and effective nursing practice. Documentation affects the quality of life and health outcomes for clients and minimizes the risk of errors and omissions. Documentation is a primary tool to facilitate interdisciplinary communication and care planning to support continuity of care and client safety. Documentation is the legal proof of the care that was provided to the client. Documentation must meet the requirements of legislation, regulations, professional standards, and employer requirements or policy. LPNs are responsible for knowing and adhering to documentation policies in the workplace. The client record, including your documentation, is a legal document. Failure to meet the standards set out by the CLPNM and/or employer policy could result in disciplinary action. Documentation serves as evidence of the healthcare services that were or were not provided to the client. Nursing documentation could be used as evidence in legal proceedings, such as criminal proceedings, coroner or medical examiner investigations and inquests, and even labor arbitrations. Your documentation may be used to reconstruct events, establish dates and times, and resolve conflicts in testimony. How well you document can help to protect you should there be a professional liability claim, workplace investigation, or a CLPNM investigation regarding your conduct or practice. Your client records will be used as evidence of the care you provided or did not provide. Documentation demonstrates how an LPN has applied their knowledge, skill, and judgment, and establishes whether a nurse's actions met the standard of care that was required in the context. Nurses know that if it wasn't documented, it wasn't done. According to the Canadian Nurses Protective Society, or CNPS, quality documentation is your best defense as a nurse. For more information on the legal aspects of nursing documentation, please access the documentation resources from CNPS available on their website at cnps.ca. Documentation should be timely, concise, factual, and objective. Quality documentation must also reflect the application of the nursing process while utilizing critical inquiry that emphasizes critical thinking and clinical judgment skills. Your documentation should demonstrate that you have identified and considered the cause and effect of relationships, and that you have distinguished between data that is relevant, which will be documented, and data that is irrelevant, which need not be documented. The nursing process includes the 5 components shown on your screen. The assessment is the analysis or interpretation of both subjective and objective data. The nursing diagnosis is determined after completing an analysis of all the gathered data. The plan of care considers the client's needs, circumstances, preferences, values, abilities, and culture, and supports the client in the self-management of their care as appropriate. Your documentation of the implementation will state the interventions you applied as identified in the plan. And finally, Your documentation will show that you have evaluated the care provided, which may result in a modification of the care plan. Several factors dictate the frequency and amount of documentation detail, including facility or employer policies and procedures, the complexity and stability of a client's health problems, the degree to which the client's condition puts them at risk, and the degree of risk involved in the treatment or care of the client. Information related to changes in the client's condition and any event not consistent with the routine care of the client should be clearly documented. According to CNPS, the preferable course is that all nursing assessments and interventions be charted, including any communications and attempts to communicate with physicians and other members of the healthcare team, information related to the administration of medication or the performance of a nursing procedures, any relevant comments made by the client and the client's family or substitute decision maker, and other visitors. Documentation should be more comprehensive, in-depth, and frequent when the client is very ill or exposed to a high degree of risk. This ensures that the client record fully captures the complexity of the client's condition and the care provided. You will document more frequently when you have a client with an emerging, urgent condition compared to how often you will document when your client is in a stable, predictable situation. As the complexity of the client's condition increases and the predictability of their outcome decreases, the frequency of your documentation should increase. On this slide, you will find a list of examples of situations and/or times to document. This is not an exhaustive list, and your employer policies may require you to document additional information. For example, in your specific setting, you may also be expected to document advanced care planning, end-of-life planning, transfers between healthcare facilities, client day passes, outings or appointments, and changes in the client's care plan. Documentation principles. Do not chart in advance of performing a treatment, an assessment, or before administering a medication. Pre-charting is illegal and can constitute falsification of the healthcare record. Pre-charted information is not credible or accountable and as such can endanger the health and safety of the client. For example, if an LPN pre-charts medication administration and gets interrupted by an emergency, the medication might not be administered or might be administered late. The other nurses on the unit will not know this and will assume the medication was administered as recorded in the chart. This could lead to missed doses, pain, or medication administered too close to the next dose. All charting entries must include the date and time the entry was made. Documenting at the time of an event or as close as possible afterwards promotes accuracy and credibility of the information. Timely documentation also facilitates communication within the interdisciplinary team. Remember, another member of the team may need to rely on your documentation later the same day, such as when you are on break. No blank lines. Draw a line through empty spaces. The principle of no blank lines helps to ensure that someone cannot add any information in the blank spaces. It also ensures that documentation is chronological. Documentation must be legible. Documentation that is illegible may lead to misinterpretation, missing information, and risk to the client. Use only employer-approved abbreviations. Entries should be made by the person directly involved in the event. An exception to this rule may occur in the role of a designated recorder during an emergency, which is referred to as third-party charting. In cases of third-party charting, employer policies are to be followed. At times, a nurse may need to document something that was reported to them by another person or care provider. In this case, it is important to cite the source of the information. All documentation is to be signed, including the recorder's designation. For example, the signature on this slide for Tessa Shaw, LPN, would appear at the end of Tessa's chart documentation. Before correcting an error, consult your employer's documentation policy. To correct an error, best practice is to draw a line through the incorrect entry and initial it, ensuring that the original recording is still legible. Then add the date and time the correction is being made. Add the new entry with the current date, time, and signature with designation. For electronic records, follow the policies and procedures of the electronic health record system as established. Do not let others access your account, as health record entries may be then attributed to you. Documentation should occur as soon as possible after providing care. There are times when a late entry is required. A late entry means adding information to a record at a later time, typically to correct, clarify, or supplement the information already documented. When making a late entry, identify the note as a late entry at the start of your note. Document the date and time of the late entry and the date and time of the care provided. Never write between the lines of a previously recorded entry or leave blank spaces to fill in later. Have knowledge of and follow employer policy regarding late entries, as your employer may want you to record late entries in a different format from the example on this slide. Incident or occurrence reports objectively describe any event that is not consistent with the routine care of a client or routine operations. Documenting occurrences or incidents is a two-step process. The LPN is required to document the occurrence in the client health record and complete an occurrence report in accordance with employer policy. Follow employer policy regarding occurrence incident reports. Before implementing a system of documentation by exception, employers should provide staff training and retraining as required, develop clinical pathways and policies and procedures, so that nurses have a clear understanding of what must be recorded. Charting by exception is a method for documenting normal findings and routine care based on clearly defined standards and predetermined criteria for nursing assessments and interventions. This method of documentation is often done on flow sheets, care maps, or clinical pathways that are based on pre-established guidelines, protocols, and procedures. If the client flow sheet, care map, or clinical pathway does not allow for a clear picture of the client's current state, what happened, or what care was provided, LPNs are advised to document thoroughly in the IPN of the client's health record. When the processes and guidelines for charting by exception are not clearly understood, this can present risks to client care. If you are not clear or have questions on charting by exception, inform your manager that you require guidance or refresher education. Remember, when in doubt, write it out. If you are not sure client care is being captured, make a note in the IPN of the client's health record. The same documentation principles apply to paper and electronic records. An LPN is legally permitted to access the records of clients who are in their care to the extent needed for that purpose. Unless there is another legitimate purpose authorized in FIA and sanctioned by the employer, the LPN must not access a client's records. Any unauthorized access of a client record is a breach of FIA and may be considered professional misconduct. This principle applies to both paper-based and electronic records. However, since electronic records provide the potential access to vast amounts of client information, they could be at greater risk for confidentiality breaches. Most employers have logs that keep track of when client records are accessed and by whom. Unauthorized access can easily be detected this way and can lead to significant consequences related to the care provider's employment and professional registration. Remember that maintaining client confidentiality is a requirement in law and in your professional standards. Virtual care refers to services that are provided when the nurse and the client are not in the same physical location. It may include telephone visits or online visits. The same documentation rules apply. When documenting virtual care, ensure to document the platform used to provide the virtual care, the consent obtained from the client to provide the care virtually, where the client is located when the virtual care is provided. Ensure you ask the client where they are located during the virtual care and document this information. The instructions provided specific to virtual care. Any follow-up provided. Not all circumstances are appropriate for virtual care. If the client care cannot be provided appropriately through virtual care, this needs to be documented, and any follow-up, referrals, or consults written must be documented. Now that we've discussed the professional standards that relate to documentation, we'll move on to discussing in more detail how the standards apply in a nurse's professional practice. After Sally, she/her, LPN, completed morning assessments and morning care on her assigned clients, it was time for her morning coffee break. Sally went for her break. While on break, one of Sally's clients, Mr. Harewood, he/him, pulled his call cord as he was experiencing excruciating abdominal pain. The relief LPN, Boris, he/him, completed an assessment and vital signs. Boris then accessed the client's chart to determine the baseline vital signs, any previous abdominal pain charted, and to see what Sally had charted regarding today's vital signs and morning assessment. Sally had not charted before she left the unit for her coffee break, so Boris did not have today's information to base his assessment on. Did Sally meet her professional standards? Pause the video to consider this practice scenario. When you restart the video, I will discuss if Sally met her professional standards or not. There are 5 standards that Sally did not meet by not charting before she left the unit for her break. Sally's professional standards identify that she should document in a record specific to each client, document client care and observations in a manner that is chronological, legible, clear, timely, accurate, comprehensive, and concise. Document in the client's record the nursing care that you provide with enough information for another healthcare professional to be sufficiently informed of the care you provided. Sally's professional standards also identify that she should provide relevant and timely information to clients and other members of the healthcare team, plan and facilitate the safe transition of clients between caseloads, practitioners, settings, and services. In this scenario, Sally completed her morning assessments and care on her assigned clients. Since she did not chart her client assessments before taking her morning break, her colleague Boris was not able to obtain today's baseline information on Mr. Harewood when the client complained of excruciating abdominal pain. Boris did not know if this client's pain and assessment findings had changed since Sally last assessed him. Leaving for a break without charting risked compromising timely and comprehensive client care. This scenario illustrates the importance of timely documentation. Sue, she, her, works on a busy medical unit which is frequently short-staffed. On occasion, Sue has worked with other LPNs who do not chart according to the CLPNM standards. Sue has acted as a mentor to some of these LPNs and enjoys this. Sue is aware that when she is not working, her colleagues may not offer mentoring to the more novice nurses on the unit when it comes to their documentation. One day, Sue looked for a documentation policy on her unit to share with another LPN. She was not able to find an employer policy on documentation. To meet her professional standards in this situation, what should Sue do? Pause the video to consider this practice scenario. When you restart the video, I will discuss what Sue should do. According to the CLPNM Standard 53, Sue should advocate for employer guidelines and policies that are consistent with the standards of the profession and legislation respecting care and custody of client records. In this situation, Sue might approach her manager and discuss how important documentation policies can be to clarify expectations and to support safe, effective, and collaborative practice. In the meantime, until a policy is developed, Sue might recommend to her colleagues to review resources on documentation. She might refer her colleagues to nursing textbooks, peer-reviewed articles, and reputable online resources that are consistent with the standards of the LPN profession. Sue might even offer this list of references to her employer to aid in the development of a documentation policy. She might share information from the Canadian Nurses Protective Society, CNPS, website related to the legal aspects of documentation. She might recommend that her LPN colleagues review the CLPNM Standards of Practice and Conduct and the CLPNM Code of Ethics. Sue might even recommend that her colleagues review this learning module again. This module will remain accessible on the CLPNM website. Peter Smith, he/him, LPN, completed a head-to-toe assessment and obtained vital signs on a new client, Mrs. Jones, she/her, who was accompanied by her daughter, Kim. Peter determined that Mrs. Jones had a small rash on her arm that would need to be monitored, and she was otherwise stable. Peter checked on Mrs. Jones every 1 to 2 hours during his shift and noticed that the rash had not changed. Peter finished and left his shift without documenting his assessments of Mrs. Jones. That evening, Kim complained to the unit manager that her mother had a terrible rash on her arm and that they never saw the nurse check the rash all day today. When the manager accessed the client record for assessment information, none was found. What may the consequences be for Peter in this situation? Pause the video to consider this practice scenario. When you restart the video, I will discuss the consequences that Peter faced. Standards related to documentation that Peter did not meet include to document in the client record the nursing care that you provide with enough information for another healthcare professional to be sufficiently informed of the care provided. Provide relevant and timely information to clients and to other members of the healthcare team. Document client care and observations in a manner that is chronological, legible, clear, timely, accurate, comprehensive, and concise. In this scenario, Peter performed assessments on his client. However, because these assessments were not documented in the client record, there is no evidence that the assessments actually occurred. Peter left himself open to accusations that he had not provided the proper care, accusations he cannot properly defend himself against. As nurses know, if it's not documented, it did not happen. Simon Wallace, they/them, LPN, works on a unit where charting by exception is used. Simon's client for the last 7 days, Mr. Cutler, he/him, has had a chronic non-healing pressure ulcer on his right posterior lower leg for 8 months. Mr. Cutler receives wound care for his ulcer once a day. Simon records that they changed the dressing each day on the Treatment Administration Record, TAR, and an assessment of Mr. Cutler's pressure ulcer risk using a Braden scale tool. On Simon's last shift, they did not document that the wound edge was surrounded by a small amount of redness, as the ulcer is chronic, and they already signed the TAR and Braden scale. Simon is off work the next day, and their colleague, Carla Martinez, she/her, LPN, notices that Mr. Cutler's leg ulcer looks red, inflamed, is warm to touch, and is draining scant yellow discharge. Carla accesses the client's IPN to determine if this is new, but no wound care information is found besides the tar and the Braden scale. Does charting by exception mean that Simon was not expected to document their wound assessments in the IPN? Pause the video to consider this practice scenario. When you restart the video, I will discuss the expectations around charting by exception. Standards that are applicable to this situation include: document in the client's record the nursing care that you provide with enough information for another healthcare professional to be sufficiently informed of the care provided. Provide relevant and timely information to clients and other members of the healthcare team. Document client care and observations in a manner that is chronological, legible, clear, timely, accurate, comprehensive, and concise. In this scenario, Simon performed daily wound assessments and wound care for their client, but did not document the new assessment finding of wound edge redness in the IPN because they had already charted by exception on the appropriate forms. Simon considered this to be sufficient. However, in this case, Simon's failure to document their new assessment finding left their colleague, Carla, without the relevant and timely information she required in providing care. Without this information, Carla was not able to judge how quickly the wound was worsening or whether it was improving. Carla was therefore unable to determine whether to perform wound care as usual or to call the prescriber to discuss wound care options for Mr. Cutler. In your practice, if documenting in flowcharts and other tools do not allow other members of the healthcare team to fully understand the results of your assessments or the care you provided, a note in the IPN is the best option. Remember, when in doubt, write it out. Geraldine Santori, she/her, LPN, learns from her sister that their friend Adam has been admitted to the hospital where she works. Geraldine works on a surgery unit and Adam is admitted to the medicine unit. Geraldine's sister is curious about Adam's condition and asks Geraldine to check Adam's chart for information when she is at work. Geraldine explains to her sister that she works on a different unit and has no professional purpose to access Adam's health information because Adam is not her client. The next day, Geraldine is on duty on her unit. Despite her sister's request, she does not access Adam's electronic health record. Pause the video to consider this practice scenario. When you restart the video, I will discuss if Geraldine met her professional obligations related to privacy and confidentiality of documentation. Since Geraldine does not access Adam's health records, she is meeting her professional standards, which state that practical nurses must follow employers' guidelines and policies respecting the care and custody of client records when those guidelines and policies are consistent with applicable legislation, including the Personal Health Information Act. Geraldine is also meeting the ethical obligation outlined in her professional code of ethics to protect client privacy and confidentiality. In this scenario, Geraldine is not in Adam's circle of care, and she understands the importance of maintaining client confidentiality. She does not put her curiosity ahead of the client's interests and does not take advantage of her position of trust. She maintains an appropriate boundary between her role as a professional member of the facility's staff and her role as Adam's friend. In doing so, Geraldine has met her professional obligations related to privacy and confidentiality of documentation. As we wrap up this learning module, a few key points are noted on this slide. Remember that the client record is a legal document in which the LPN demonstrates how they have applied their knowledge, skill, and judgment in providing client care. The client record is vital for safe healthcare. Documentation helps other members of the healthcare team understand the client's status and the care you provided. Clear and timely records help protect the client from errors and omissions that could lead to harm. Nursing documentation can be used as evidence in regulatory investigations, disciplinary matters, and legal proceedings. Remember, if it is not documented, there is no evidence it was done. When in doubt, write it out. Maybe you found this module has reinforced your existing knowledge and documentation practices, or possibly you've identified areas for improvement. Either way, we hope that you are completing this module with a strong understanding of why good nursing documentation is essential. Now that you have completed this learning module, your next step will be to confirm your understanding of the material by completing a brief quiz. Note that attaining a successful result on the quiz is a requirement for your 2025 registration renewal. In fact, as part of the CLPNM's new Continuing Competence Program, an annual professional learning module and quiz is now a requirement for registration renewal every year. This means that until you complete the quiz and achieve a successful result, your upcoming application for registration renewal will not move forward to the approval stage. All questions are answered in this module, and you can return to this module as many times as you like. You are also free to consult any resources available on the CLPNM website, such as the Standards of Practice and Conduct and the Code of Ethics. A successful result is 80% or 12 out of 15 questions. You will have up to 3 attempts. Each time you start the quiz, you will have up to 90 minutes to complete it. We estimate that for most LPNs, 15 minutes will be plenty. However, we have allotted 90 minutes in case you need to re-watch portions of this module. We recommend that you don't start the quiz unless you know you have enough time to complete it in one sitting. The quiz is a test of your individual knowledge, so be sure not to collaborate with colleagues when completing it. Also note that any attempts to make a record of quiz questions and answers or sharing questions and answers would be unethical and may be deemed professional misconduct. If for some reason you are unable to complete the quiz in 3 attempts, please reach out to us to discuss your next steps. You are likely wondering at this point where to find the quiz. The quiz has been set up in your online registration profile. To access your online registration profile, first visit our website at clpnm.ca, then select I want to log into my online profile. You will find this option in the top right-hand corner of our home page. Once you have logged in, you should see the quiz is available to you under My Exams on your dashboard. Launch the quiz by clicking on the small plus icon to the right. Your result will be automatically recorded in your online registration profile. Thank you for participating today. If you have any questions about this learning module or your documentation standards, please reach out to the CLPNM Practice Department using the contact information shown on your screen. You are also encouraged to visit the CLPNM website, where you will find many of the resources mentioned in this learning module, including those listed on this slide. You will find our website at clpnm.ca, or if you prefer, you can pause this video and use this QR code to access our website. Additional resources and references related to documentation which were consulted during the creation of this module are listed here and on the next slide.